I won an award, quote unquote, but it was a very ironic award. They made up awards at this art show, and it was I won most preciously overworked art. And I laughed. I got my little statuette, but I thought, God, that's rough. It's like because that any good zinger lands because it's accurate. That one that one landed hard.
Hey, welcome. As the years pass, I identify the inherent conflict of my being. I'd say that I have at least 6 active hobbies and interests going on at a time, plus a half dozen more semi-actives. These, plus myriad personal projects, my novels being chief among them, Molly, friends, family, life, and work, they just bog down my system. And I'm not alone in this. I mean, creative people, they're always busy. And my peccadillo is that I'm a monotasker, which makes it very hard to make great advancement on many different things because work and life interject on an unscheduled basis. And so I just don't find the time to really just kind of plow through stuff. So it's very tough because, the road to traditional publishing, it's not easy. And even if you have a hit book in your back pocket, it doesn't matter. The industry is really well guarded to protect the publishers, editors, and agents from like the tens of thousands of fire hoses of would-be authors aiming at them at all times. So I totally understand that because they wouldn't be able to do their job. And the hard part is that I established my comic book and graphic design career on developing personal connections, phone calls and later on emails. That was how I got in the front door. What I did after that was all on me. But the publishing industry doesn't afford an easy avenue for this. And the chief pipeline in is the dreaded query letter. Over the past year, I've done the research and made passes at this literary cold call, but I never felt like I nailed it. With my 2024 goal of landing representation for my book series, I need to have 3 things in place: a finished manuscript, a query letter, and a synopsis in 3 sizes: half page, 1 page, and 2 pages. And I have the book done, but the query and the synopsis, they need help. So to apply the money and timeline standard to getting this done, I registered for a 2-part query letter workshop. Last week was the first night. There were no great revelations, but it forced me to gather up all the elements and work on the damn thing, knowing that there's a clock running and that I've paid for this, and I carved time out of my schedule to work on this. Tomorrow will be the second and final night of the workshop to get this thing in shape. Of course, if you've been paying attention to this opening, you'll know that leaves the synopsis, and I can't even wrap my head around that now. That is one of the banes of my existence, is taking a gigantic thing like a novel and reducing it to these bite-sized bits. Last week I mentioned my friend Brett Lewis is recovering from a significant brain trauma event, and the support has been amazing. The word went out. The GoFundMe is doing quite well. They raised their goal, and which is great. Of course, that just means keep getting the message out there because we want to really help Brett have all the runway he needs to get back into life. If you could pass the message on, however it is, by sharing this podcast, by looking up his GoFundMe, which is in the show notes, and sharing that with people. If you are a fan of his writing, his book like The Wintermen and many others. He is someone you want to have back at the keyboard. He's great, and I hope I hope it all works for him. So let's get the algorithm working for Brett. So today's guest is Bob Fingerman. Bob is he is an icon in the industry. I'm sure he's cringing if he hears that. But he is just one of the people that many of my generation saw as a guy who was leading the charge because he was just a few years older than us and he had the flag and he was doing his thing. If we were inclined to do our thing, our own thing, Bob was a person you looked at. It was a great talk, lots of laughing, no surprise, and just a lot of candor, sort of some really deep thoughts. And Bob's talking about his new book, That's Some Business You're In. And it's a retrospective of his career for over 40 years, or I guess 40 years now. Let's not make Bob older than he is. It's coming out on Zoop, I guess as today or maybe tomorrow, but there's a link in the description. You can go check out the campaign. I got to read a preview, really enjoyed it. The art, it's great to see a creator's arc, from childhood through the early years and on as a person who enjoys this type of work. We get a big kick to see all these elements and a lot of the working drawings. I mean, Bob has got a million styles in his pocket. It's a great conversation. I really, really hope you enjoyed as much as I had having it. That's a terrible way to finish a sentence, but that's what you get. So this is me, Bob Fingerman.
Wait, tell me when we're recording.
We're always recording.
Oh dear.
Yeah, no, it's a magical start. We just start and then I find a point which it becomes like a contact point. But let me just say,
very good.
When I started at SVA in 1987, your ghost was still haunting the halls in some fashion.
I don't doubt it. I was kind of a jerk. So looking back at my SVA years, oh boy, looking back at, well, I mean, that's kind of I suppose that's sort of the theme of this conversation in a way. If you're preparing a book that's a career overview, it's also a life overview.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not necessarily going to like everything you see in your past. So you're kind of confronted not only by what you did, but who you were when you did it. I'm not saying I was a monster at SVA, but I think I probably could have been nicer to people. I was very, everyone, I don't know if everyone does, but I think certainly a lot of artists go through their angry young man phase or angry, at least young person phase.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
And my first year at SVA, I think I was an absolute horror because I went through that year pretty much with a chip on my shoulder because I felt like I had taken a step backwards. So that year, I think I was entitled because, I went to the High School of Art and Design. And so I'd already done all of the foundation year stuff for the last few years. So I thought, like, wait, why am I doing this rudimentary
all over
stuff again? It just feels like I've been here, I've done this. And so I was awful, other than life drawing. Life drawing was great because I never got to work with, nude models before, but
it was interesting that I think they are, are in the terms of the 80s, they were dead set on their foundation curriculum, as if this is like, I think it would have been like an achievement, to have gotten out of any one of those 5 sort of courses that they were like running us through.
I think I did manage to bail on, sculpture. For some reason, I managed to bail on that.
I don't think you missed anything.
And And that's because I made such a show of it. Again,
Or like,
I couldn't do things, I couldn't do half measures. I remember what these are the things that are burned into your memory forever
mm-hmm.
because you feel like, that was sort of a triumph and a failure all at once. It was, you know, a failure of character and a triumph of sarcasm.
Right.
Because I remember it was early in the year and we had to do, it was going to be reductive as opposed to additive sculpture with clay. It was reductive by chipping from a piece of a big block of plaster. And so the teacher had everyone go out and get a cardboard box to pour the plaster into. And I remember me and one other person were like, okay, well, we're going out to get foil and Vaseline. And the teachers, you don't need to do that. So we went out, we lined our boxes with foil, smeared Vaseline, then poured. And when everyone else was trying to peel off the cardboard, which
The
of
cardboard
course
from the
had
surface.
bonded
Yeah.
to the thing, I just lifted my box and let the plaster slide right out and then shatter on the ground just to show that it would come out. And then I left and I said, I won't be back. And I wasn't. So it was both one of those like, oh yeah, I sure showed that
It
teacher. And
was
on
your
the other hand,
moment.
it was, yeah, but what a I don't know, what a poor victory that is. So
Oh,
anyway, that was first year at SVA was, occasionally getting thrown out of classes, occasionally making other students cry because I thought that parodying other people's work would be funny because it's like,
mm,
hey, Mad Magazine, National Lampoon, parody's funny. Well, not when you're parodying the nice, sensitive kids' work. So awful, awful. Hi, everyone. I'm Bob. Hi, listeners. You're listening to a monster, but I'm a monster in recovery. So please, I
it's
promise. I promise I look back and I say, okay, do better, do better. That's my
do
motto, do
well.
better.
I remember, there. It was quick, this installation of the snark, tear it apart gene. Like it felt like that was immediately you're inoculated into that one, going to that, like at the school in those days where it was just like time to rip everything apart and be sort of like kind of negative towards things rather than just be like completely excited about everything.
Well, I think, yeah, that's also a consequence of the whole Gen X. I mean, Reagan was still president, there was a lot of, not that anger ever goes out of fashion, but I think there was a sort of air of futility combined with optimism. It was this sort of like, I'm going to do great, but why bother?
Right, right.
So I don't know. I mean, I know my first year there, Afghanistan won, let's call it that. Afghanistan
Sure.
won was going on, and they were talking about bringing back the draft.
I remember that.
And I was terrified. I was like, I remember going to sign up for selective service on my 18th birthday with my mom. We went to, I think it was the post office, and I was absolutely petrified. I thought, I don't want to go. And she said, don't you worry about that. Well, you're going to go to Canada. My son's not going off to fight in Afghanistan. And when I told my dad that, and of course he was a World War II vet, uh, with great disgust, he said to me, "You're not a pacifist, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm a coward." And he kind of looked at me and he just sort of smirked. It was like, what am I going to do?
Uh,
So
I mean,
there you go.
it's the right answer. I'm a coward. I love it. It's you can't argue that one.
Yeah, and
I
it
love.
wasn't strictly speaking true either. But then again, my political views weren't particularly nuanced at that point. It's not like I could say, well, I think that this whole thing is, yeah, I
Yeah.
was, believe me, I was not picking up the New York Times when I was
No.
18. I was reading heavy metal and underground comics.
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, and thank you for forwarding your book. That's some business you're in, because I've enjoyed reading the whole thing. It's just great.
Oh well, they did send. Okay, yeah, because that's just a taste. Because there's a lot more. There's a lot more.
It's no, it's great, and there's so many sort of identification points that I just think are these commonalities that many cartoonists share in in their upbringing and the experiences, whether they were in New York City or not in New York City. I think there's a
Yeah,
this sort of there's a great sense of an outsider in many cartoonists, and
yeah.
I was a tiny kid growing up. I was just like this
Oh,
little wee lad, and I think being able to draw was my ability to have agency around me.
I'm sorry. Am I speaking or are you speaking? No, that's exact. I mean, that's yeah. I was the tiniest kid for many years. I was not just the smallest boy in my class. I was the smallest kid in my grade. So yeah, I can relate.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just so when I was reading your reflection on that, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, that was absolutely me. Like spending my weekends, with my father, from the divorced family, and just
Mm.
getting lost in every little thing I could make, with my hands, and have fine by me.
Yeah, yeah. Those are also yeah. There's so many things that um, are part of the artistic DNA that obviously plenty of non-artists share. I mean, children of divorce don't all become artists, but it might not hurt. It might be part of the journey. Um, you know, both my parents were frustrated, uh, not encouraged creators themselves. They never got any. I will say this, for all my dad's kind of chagrin with my subject matter, he was never chagrined by my doing art. Let me turn off my mail so that I don't get those chimes going during the recording. But yeah, he took kind of offense at not offense. Offense is the wrong word. Like I say, it was just more like there was a lot of why do you waste your talent with such ugliness? That was a
Mm,
big one.
mm.
And looking back, I don't have a good argument for why, other than I don't know. Again, a lot of anger, a lot of being attracted to things that are repellent, um, but never discouraged. I think he would have preferred I broaden my horizons a bit.
Well, it's funny because you mentioned the wacky packs in your book, and
Sure.
like those things were like huge in the in the early '70s. That was like model kits and wacky packs were just like everywhere, and at least in my perspective of life. And I don't know whether it is because I mean we were both very young at that point, but the Vietnam War was underway, and it was a sort of this painful blemish on the country at the moment. And I don't like I think a lot of that stuff was culturally reflected in these types of counterculture elements, what from cartoons, you know, including Mad and the Lampoon.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, like you say, at a really early age, you don't necessarily understand the what, but you understand how it's affecting what's around you. And so, there were, even growing up in a place is, relatively conservative, middle of the road is Rego Park, Queens. Rego Park, Queens being adjacent to Forest Hills, Queens. Most people haven't heard of Rego Park, but they have heard of Forest Hills because of the tennis stadium. Um, Rego Park, also home of Art Spiegelman. Um, but, there were counterculture bookstores in those days, even in that kind of neighborhood, and, hippie type stores. And so you'd go in and everywhere were anti war posters, and certainly lots of anti-Richard Nixon uh, propaganda, good propaganda, but still propaganda. And, it imprints. I mean, I've, there are drawings in my collection of stuff from when I was a kid. I have drawings of Nixon. I was doing
Mm-hmm.
little caricatures of Nixon when I was, 8 years old, probably 8 or 9 years old. And uh, so, yeah, they're all things that definitely shape a worldview. And again, the kind of things that motivate your pen or pencil or crayon on paper, um, even before you really understand why.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great point because like I was thinking like how like what like what are the touchstones and touch points that like for you that made these sort of pathways toward where you went, with your career as it was when you were young. I mean, we don't really know what the career is. We just doing the thing. Um, I know I can point out like three or four things that I know were like, oh, like this is the inevitable direction I'm going to head because of these things. Like because like I mean, like Mad Magazine obviously was a huge influence on you. Um,
Hmm.
but I remember being on a summer vacation, and I don't know, back in the 70s, you could go to tag sales and buy a box of comic books for like $1, because they were just getting rid of the comic books that their kids had left behind. And I ended up buying like a box full of 60s Mad magazines, like from around 64. And I spent like a whole summer reading those things, like back and forth over and over again. But I didn't pursue that. There were other things that but it didn't make that complete connection to me. Um, like what were the things? Because I think I'd already been hit in the head like with, I don't know, maybe Star Wars at that point or something, and that sort of filled up a huge space in the brain.
It's funny, yeah, because for me, before I mean, Star Wars came out at the right time because I was 12 when it came out. But for me, Logan's Run was
Oh man,
everything for the longest
it was
while.
so cool. It was so cool.
And try to tell someone once upon a time Logan's Run was the coolest thing, with everyone walking around in their
Hmm.
primary colored little onesie dresses and stuff, and in a shopping mall. And it's like, but once upon a time that was pretty badass, especially the oh god, how could I forget what they called the hunters in that? But at any rate, I mean, it was runners and Sandmen, the Sandmen.
Yes, the Sandmen,
once
right?
once upon a time, you were a Sandman before Neil Gaiman came along. Anyway, regardless, but yeah, the early stuff, it's too much of a in a way, it's too much of a melange. I think the thing is, I've always been sort of an outlier in that comic books themselves were not that important to my choosing my career path, at least until a certain age. um, because I didn't like superheroes, and that's pretty much what everything was. And I didn't like romance comics, and the humor comics mostly were pitched a little too young, even when I was a kid. Like things like all the Harvey comics, Casper, and all that. Even when I was really little, it was like, this is not for me. So yeah, Mad was, and it's also funny because Mad was one of those early things I was almost scared of, because the drawing was a little grotesque. And
Yeah.
the first person I knew that read Mad was my babysitter's daughter, who was only a couple of years older. But again, when you're very young, a couple of years make a difference. And she read Mad, and I would kind of look at it and it was like, ooh, that's interesting, but I don't know, I don't think I'm big enough for that. And I remember like looking through an early one. It might have been a super special. All I remember is that it kind of in a way let me know this is not for you, because occasionally they would use photography. It wasn't always illustrated. And they did, I think, a TV Guide parody or something that they bound in that was like the size of TV Guide. And I remember there was a photo of Hitler. Of course, it was an actor just dressed as Hitler
Right.
because he was making a stupid face. But I thought, I know who Hitler is. This is definitely too old for me. And I just kind of put it right back down. It took a while to kind of, I
Yeah.
mean, it sounds so, I was also a fairly, sorry, I have a scratchy voice today. It's morning. I haven't had my coffee yet. Um, but I was also a fairly squeamish kid.
Okay.
So anything with blood was kind of no fly for me. My dad, I remember, again, I'm keep talking about my dad, but my dad at a certain point said, "Boy, you sure changed your spots." Because it was like I
Hmm.
went from like no, no, to suddenly I'm like drawing the most grotesque gore that ever, and his, but it's like, yeah, there again, switches get clicked. But when Plop came along, this is all a long roundabout way of saying when Plop debuted, it was suddenly like, oh, this is a comic book for me,
Yeah.
because it was humor and it was kind of gross and it was stupid but also clever, and it had, you know, I mean, again, I was just learning who people were, but Basil Wolverton and Wallace Wood and Bernie Wrightson and all these people were doing stuff in Plop, and it was very instantly on board with that. That debuted at just the right time. I think I was 9 when it debuted, and but the comics that I read were the stuff my dad had in his apartment, and he was not a comic book guy, but he had humor paperbacks. So, I mean, it's all the basic stuff, and then a couple that are a little weird for a kid to be into, because he had Peanuts, instantly gravitated to Peanuts, Pogo, still think Pogo is one of the all-time masterpieces. But he also had um Lil Abner,
Okay.
Jules Pfeiffer, and Gay and Wilson. And those really became, those were the building blocks for me. So, like, even at a young age, I was looking at Jules Pfeiffer way before I got the jokes. Because I was looking at Pfeiffer probably from about the age of 4 or 5 on, and there was something about his very natural spidery line. It was so unstructured in a way. Like everything else had a kind of look where you understood the building blocks of it.
Mm-hmm.
But Pfeiffer, only years later did I learn of his technique of drawing with like like basically with wooden sticks, just everything being very disposable. He didn't use pens. He would dip in like skewers, like
Right.
basically wooden barbecue skewers or things like that. It's like, okay, that's why his stuff looks like the way it looks. It
And
looks so
almost like
odd.
unreproducible in a sense. Like an artist who's making their own tools, not only is their hand eye going to be different, the tool is so different that it's just them.
Yeah. But his work, once I did start reading it, it opened up that part of my brain where it was like, oh, you can talk about real stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You can talk about, it doesn't just have to be a joke. I mean, a joke is good, but you can, like, he had people monologuing, that was which was revolutionary. And so that was a big deal for me in seeing that. And then the other, maybe one of the most important books in my entire development, was Gay and Wilson's book Nuts,
Okay.
which was the strip that he did for Lampoon. But they put out a paperback collecting a chunk of it. And when I saw that book and was reading again these strips about being a kid that didn't portray it as fun, they portrayed all the horrors of childhood. Uh, I just okay. Now I really am beginning to understand my path.
Mm.
And again, there's this. I'm not going to get there for a while, but I kind of have a clearer view of what I can do. And then Heavy Metal Magazine debuted, and then it was all over. It was
And
like, okay,
then everything
now
goes
I'm going to
crazy.
work
Yeah.
with these disparate stimuli: Pfeiffer, Gahan Wilson, heavy metal,
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean,
and Matt.
they're all these sort of like fantastical ways of telling. It is sort of, I guess, interesting or real stories as possible. Like if you can look at those like in an abstract.
Well, they're all so deeply personal. I think that was another thing that didn't work for me about a lot of comics, is in a way they did feel like product to me.
Sure.
Even as a kid, I was like, hmm, you know, not for me. It's fine, not for me. Um, but when I started reading work that you could really feel the personality of the artist and what was important to the creator and all that, that resonated on a very deep level for me. And that's why Peanuts also resonated because, I mean, let's face it, Charles Schulz made a very good career of channeling a lot of childhood pain
Mm-hmm.
into his work. It's why the kids worked for me and Snoopy didn't so much.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. There's a. I think. I think what might be the connective tissue is the point of view. Like those, all those things that you're citing, all have a point of view. The
Oh yeah.
creators are making things with a point of view, and it's not a question of facility, because the people who are writing and telling stories for Marvel or DC, that's not in question. Like they can do all that stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
but there's very little point of view in the engagement factor, because you have to be invested as a reader into the sort of the history of the characters to be able to extract something from that, because it's not this sort of like, here's what happened to me, or here's a telling of a story of these people and it happened. And no, it's the character that we ultimately know that the character will triumph. And that's the, and that little, that if you're, if you can't suspend that bit of, fantasy, or the reality, and make it a fantasy, it's never going to work. You're just going to go, no interest. um
Yeah.
and that's the thing. And there's that commonality of, young person, pencil in hand, hyper focused on a drawing. Like there's this, you're all in into whatever that thing is. And I think when you look at a Gahan Wilson piece, that's still happening in that person as an adult when they're creating that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And they're very in touch with that stuff. Um yeah, and I say all this. It took me a long time to get comfortable consciously sharing at a certain level in my work. I think subconsciously I was sharing way more than I probably was aware of.
Oh, but you were so clever and nobody ever caught on.
Well, including me. But I don't think it was even clever. There was a certain, again, you reveal things through your work, whether intended or not, unless you're, just someone who's absolutely robotic and it's like, I am going to just plow through this work and, it's going, and even there, you're probably revealing a lot about yourself too. But like looking at a lot of this, the student work again, that stuff is so easy to read, you don't need to be a particularly astute person to see what a teenager's going through when they're pouring out creative output on paper. It's like, okay, this is a very sexually frustrated person. This is a very angry person who feels helpless in his own skin. This is someone who definitely does not feel like he has agency and can take charge. So he's going to have his characters enact horrible acts of vengeance and violence. I mean, basically, there's all these things where you're working through stuff, and you think, well, that's not me. That's this character,
Mm-hmm.
and all it takes is an older person, a parent, or whatever, to look and just say, "Yikes!" It's like, okay. And then you get all embarrassed and you put it in a drawer and you don't finish it.
Yeah.
But
And I agree. Listen, I mean, I don't. It's taken me a very long time to express my personal meanness in a thing that I do, because I stood behind the idea of making product for a long time. That was it. I'm using the skill sets that I've had or developed to do the work, and that's fine. Um, and it's a great challenge, but it's probably a bit safer, maybe in some way, to do it when you're 50 years old, and you can kind of think about it and have a little bit more sort of a studied approach to it. But when you're young, it's it can be pretty harrowing to just kind of express something, like, because, like, listen, we all wrote bad poetry at one point or another in our life, that was never seen by another person. And too bad this is an audio podcast. That was a great face, Bob. And
was was that the face of, I never did that?
yeah, right. um but like it but that's but that clearly, it's like you said, it sneaks out until it becomes an intention. And do you have a moment, like, can you think of, like, oh, this is when I first tried it, or and was it terrifying, or what?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I probably still am a bit guarded in my work. This is all building blocks towards something. Um, this is where caging things with humor, or there are all these things you do to kind of mitigate just how real your realness is going to be. And so, you know I still haven't really gotten there. Like, minimum wage was a comic series. I can't assume everyone listening knows what I've done, but I did a comic book series for a number of years. Started in the mid 90s, did 10 issues of it for Fantagraphics, plus a sort of a pilot episode graphic novel to start it. And and then it hibernated, and then I brought it back for Image a bunch of years later. But it was the closest I'd ever gotten to doing like something real and honest and autobiographical, and it's pretty close. But the thing is, when there's also tons of omissions, I won't call them sins of omission, because I think they were smart. There's certain things, and you conflate certain things, and you combine certain things, and you leave out certain things, and you shift your chronology a bit, because, well, that thing that happened to me would work better here. All of
Sure.
that starts to make it less and less honest. So it has to use Stephen Colbert's word, truthiness. It's definitely more than truth adjacent, because there was a lot of stuff in it that was very candid, and maybe too candid. um, but even there, and this also, it's again, one of the things of putting together a career overview book and looking at everything. Obviously, there's a lot of narcissism in there's narcissism in putting out work publicly, period. You know really, once it leaves your hands, and this is again, it's that whole art and commerce thing. Once the art that you were slaving over for little or no money leaves your hands, it does become product, even if it is very artistic and very pure and so forth. Suddenly it's a thing on a shelf that people can buy. So that by definition is product. So how much do you want to, bare your soul to a public?
Yeah.
Well, there are degrees. And so I kind of found my comfort level, at least for certain chunk of my life, maybe as the grave begins to loom a little larger, it'll, who knows, if anyone's still reading books, I like to think that moment isn't coming too soon. Maybe there'll be something that's completely unguarded. But for the time being, I think it's enough. Like, the truth is, some of the most autobiographical moments have been in genre stuff. They're in the novels that I wrote. They're because, especially my first novel, which was a book called Bottom Feeder. It's a vampire novel, but it's very internal, and so there's a lot of my thoughts in that character's head. Not every character. I mean, some people say every character you create's just a facet of you. Maybe that's true. I don't know if I agree with that. I think when you're writing, you can write things that are not you. You can write things that are observed as opposed to experienced. Especially if you're creating, I don't know, supervillains or whatever. You're not necessarily that. But there's probably a little to that. But the thing is, the kind of books that I write, it's probably truer because they're either. I've never been very good about covering my tracks. I won't say I haven't been very smart about it, but I haven't been very, um, yeah. Because I mean, basically, anytime I base a character on somebody I know in real life, in the case of minimum wage, most of them just looked like their real life counterparts. I only gave myself the luxury of hiding behind this blonde, blue eyed avatar. But,
Right.
it's like, well, that's not me. Clearly, that's not me. Look at him. He's blonde. He has blue eyes. It can't be me.
Everyone's
And
looking at you
everyone else
sitting at
is
the
like, well,
table at
why
the
does this?
con.
Yeah. So, but, with the exception of a few characters in minimum wage who didn't look anything like their real life counterparts, pretty much everyone was just, and by the way, and I cleared it all. It was like, you cool with me putting you in this comic? Yeah. Are you cool with me using this story, this embarrassing story that you shared with
Right.
me or that we lived together? And they're like, yeah, it's fine. So, but not everyone, not everyone. The romantic interest in minimum wage was based on my first wife. And, she and I were long apart at that point, but I wanted to do something real. I wanted to do something, what's something I've experienced. And I can kind of do an arc where it has a beginning, middle, and an end. And, I never reached out to her and said, hey, by the way, you okay with me doing a fictionalized version of you in a comic? And, for years I wondered, did she ever see it? And I found she definitely saw it. And she apparently marched into a comic shop once and declared herself my muse. So make of that what you will.
Okay.
There are pitfalls, hey, at least she took it in stride.
Sure. She didn't have a shotgun in her hand, so I guess it's a win, right?
Yeah. So, but I think that was a very convoluted and rambling answer, possibly, to your question. I lose the thread.
Well, I hope I can keep grasp of the threads and the frayed ends here. But the I think that the use of an avatar is that sort of that, and asking your friends, it's kind of a dragnet approach. You sort of change the names to protect the innocent kind of approach to making these stories come together, because the intention isn't to burn. you know at that point, like, I think when you're, maybe if you're college Bob might want to burn, but adulter Bob is trying to tell something greater rather than just get it out and get them. That's a guess.
I certainly make no promises that I have not been an asshole to people, but it's less intentional than it used to be. um, I assume I can use off-color language on this podcast.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm behaving. I'm being a good boy, keeping it down to a bare minimum, but occasionally, anyway. But yeah, I mean, I don't think you can get through life without. This is an interesting thing, and to put it in very comic book terms, um, you're always going to become somebody else's villain at some point. You want to. It's the hero's journey for you,
Mm-hmm.
but there's always going to be the byproducts of some of your journey are either hurting people, sometimes, hopefully unintentionally, but it happens. And so, yeah, in your work, you can at least be a bit more judicious about how you dole out that kind of misbehavior. I've based characters on people where, they had very outsized uh, quirks or things where it was like, well, they always say you're a writer, write what you know, and then you write it, and then you think, ooh, if that person ever reads this, they're
Right.
going to know that that's them. It's too specific, it's like you wrote something very specific there. Yes, it's not their name. And then you can absorb, well, did the quote unquote giant scare quotes work of art merit possibly hurting somebody, or was that your best choice? Could you
Right.
have disguised it better or not? um I yeah, that's a kind of a constant battle, especially when you do more real life type stories. I mean, or at least your approach to genre is very grounded. When you're doing stuff where you want it to really feel grounded, the things that ground you are the people in your life or the experiences you've had. And yeah,
How do you go? Like, how do you process that when you're in, you know, the time of creating the piece? So if you're writing out the thing and you get the idea and you're like, this, oh, this could use this, but like, do you seek out that and engage with that memory and those events with the people to try to help build this narrative, or do you or are you adverse to it and then have to kind of force yourself to do it? Like, what is the natural inclination?
I don't think, yeah, there's not a one size fits all answer to that, because I think it's very kind of case by case. um I mean, I wrestle with stuff all the time. Maybe not, I don't get to the pin, but the wrestling's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's a really hard question to answer. Ums are great for podcasting. Everybody loves little bits of dead air. Let's listen to somebody think. But I don't. It's like I don't want to be glib either. I don't really have a good answer for that, because I think it's always a process of when you're mining your own life, when you're mining your own experience. In my case, truth is, the first thing is, does this make a good story? Is this an accessible story? Because I don't put the audience first. but I do always contemplate the audience
Okay.
because I'm not working in a vacuum, or at least I'm trying not to work in a vacuum. I am trying to do work that will eventually be read by people. You know, that's where maybe my work is a little less pure. There is contemplation, there is consideration. That's a better word, consideration of the audience. Um, so, because there are also times where it's like, well, that's a great story, but does it organically work within what I'm trying to do? Or am I going to crowbar it in there just because I like that story?
Yeah.
And that's where, you know, the classic kill your darlings thing comes in, because there have definitely been times where I have said, and I write it and it's good, and then I read it in the context of everything around it and say, all right, get rid of it. I wrote it, I got it out of my system, get rid of it. um and you know, maybe some friend or acquaintance in my past was spared picking up a book and saying, "What the? Wait a minute! Why is this
Yeah.
story in this book?" So, occasionally, some bullets are dodged through being a little bit more prudent.
Well, how do you like? So, I mean, you're saying that in the you're is a process, and you're going through it, on revisions and how you work your way through something. When those times come when you look at something and you go, "Oh boy, this might be too much." Now, let's say it fits within the story. It fits. There's no crowbarring necessary. Like it fits in the story. It's right.
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage and walk it? Like, do you say, okay, I need to walk this back some? Maybe I'm not going to deliver the greatest, punch to the nose to the reader, but I'm taking, into account the person who this was based off of. I'm just really super curious about like how you would handle that.
Uh, yeah, probably not as much as I should have. I mean, by the way, it's not like there's this. I'm painting a picture of me just leaving a path of destruction behind me.
Right. You mean you're dropping plaster blocks all over the place?
Yeah, it's really not that. I mean, if anything, it's really only a couple of people along, you know, well, more than a couple, but less than a handful, let's put it that way, of people who may or may not have been super keen to have themselves fictionalized and dressed up in other clothes and all that kind of thing. But, and you know, this is the other thing. This is a consequence I've learned kind of recently is, you know, relationships change too. So sometimes people you've portrayed that you were really tight with, you end up
Yeah.
going your separate ways at a certain point, and then you look at the work, and then it's just sort of a thorn in your side because you're like, oh god. And it's not even because it's not good work or anything like that. It's just like, well, that's somebody I don't have that kind of relationship with anymore. So now it feels kind of sad to look at this work, you know, even if
Uh-huh.
it's funny work. So all I'll say is it's a minefield when you do use your own life for, you know, it goes from mining your life. One, let's, yeah, oh boy, here I'm being super clever. You're mining your life using the word mine in one way, and then it becomes mines in a very different way. Um, and that's something I also haven't always taken into consideration, because when you're doing things or living things, they feel like forever, like, oh, this is never going to change.
Mm-hmm.
And the, you know, the nature of life is change. So uh
Yeah. I
it's
mean, you're
it's
you're you're
precarious.
speaking to me. Yeah.
It's very precarious.
No,
um
I had that exact same thing happen to me recently in the terms of a character that I've put a lot of time and energy into, and I don't have a relationship with this person. And it's really, really tough. Like I'm like, do I have to go in and dig something out, or how, like I'm not sure how I'm going to approach it, or do I just say I have to feel that discomfort and with engagement with this character moving forward as the creator, but not as not what goes on paper.
Yeah. Yeah, I yeah, that is case by case. I mean, I did a book um a number of years ago called From the Ashes. Book I'm very proud of. There's been interest, a couple of times of putting that book back in print, and I have to say no because the book was a uh, I called it a speculative memoir, but it was about my wife and I in post-apocalyptic New York. Well, I am divorced
Right.
now. That marriage
Yeah.
is over. And
Yeah.
it was a very long marriage. And when I did it, I thought, well, this is forever,
Right.
at that
This
point.
is a time capsule to our, yeah.
And there's a case where it's like, well, that book to me is, it was done, it was definitely done with love. Um, but it would not feel right to put it out. And there's a case where, well, there is another person involved, and I don't think she would want that book out there. So that book is a dead book. Certain books become dead books. And that's something else you don't necessarily anticipate,
No.
where you do something. I mean, a book feels, well, a book is forever. Surely a book is forever. Well, it isn't. It is and it isn't. It can be two
Yeah.
things at the same time. So, yeah, it's tricky. It's
Well,
tricky.
this has actually helped me frame it because I really kind of think I have to honor the intention of what I had created, and also recognize that the characterization is from a period in time. It's not from now. It's not from 10 years from now. It's an encapsulation of a certain period in time, and that's it. So it's not a commentary on anything else, and it's not even a commentary, but it's not even a reflection of anything else but one moment. So I think I can live with that. You were talking about your prose writing, and in your first novel, and you were saying how you were prosecuting sort of like personal stuff, in a lot of stuff in that work.
Mm.
But question to you is, was your point of view in that storytelling first person or third person?
Oh, it's first person.
Okay, so
It
that
was
makes that
first person present tense, which was an interesting challenge, but that's a whole other conversation.
for sure. Yeah, wow, okay. Yeah. But that does, I think that opens that doorway into that, telling those chunks of your life. It makes it a lot easier in many ways. Or at least the avenue of it is right there. You can just pipe it right in.
Yeah. Um Maybe. I mean, it definitely in my case did because it really was I mean, the DNA of that book certainly was, well, what if I was a vampire? I mean, let's be honest, and then it was like, okay, I don't want to make it me, but I'm certainly going to use me as the armature to build this character on. Um, and again, it's interesting. I'm going to jump to my second novel for a moment. Just one of the things that's part of my creative disposition is always wanting to make whatever I've done better. And so every time a book gets a second printing, I Lucas it. I'm completely sympathetic to Uncle George and his,
Uh-huh.
quixotic attempt to make everything better. He doesn't get to do that anymore, but I'm still looking forward to ats and so forth being in a director's cut of American Graffiti someday. I live in hope. But I famous is the wrong word, infamous is too strong, but I've every edition of minimum wage is different than a previous one. I go in and I redraw and I blah 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 blah. Some people think it's horrible and why are you ruining it? Other people don't notice. Whatever. It's all, again, it's for me. But I did that with my second novel. So I wouldn't touch my first novel. Honestly, I think it's the time capsule I want it to be. But the second novel I wrote, well, I won't go off on too long a tangent about that. The first draft was just way too dark, way too dark. It was literally too dark to be published. Um, and a friend of mine who was a novelist, after I'd been rejected a few times, I gave it to him to read, and he said, "Yeah, this book's unpublishable." And I was like, "Wow, that's strong. Why?" And on a storytelling note, he was right. He's like, "Well, there's really no arc to it." He says it starts miserable, it ends miserable, and it's miserable all the way through. And he said, and it's very, very, very claustrophobic. It's like, okay, well, I can work with that. And then, it started building out from there, sold it, but it was still very dark. But I wrote it before that book came out in 2010 originally, and I wrote it before I'd experienced certain things in real life in a really deep, meaningful way.
Okay.
When the opportunity came to put out a new edition of it in 2021, I thought, well, let me reread it, and I reread it, and having experienced loss in certain ways that I hadn't. It's that whole thing again of observed versus experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Well, by the time 2021 had rolled along, I had lost both my parents by that point. Many friends, unfortunately, have also, in pet terms, gone across the rainbow bridge. There's things where when you write it and haven't really felt grief, like that kind of grief, you're like, I can go in and rewrite a little. Because it is a book very steeped in loss. I mean, it's, that one, okay. In macro, it's a zombie book. Fine. But it's a very intimate one. It's almost, it could pretty much be done as a play. It's very kind of, that was where some of the claustrophobia comment came. It got opened out a bit from that. Whole point being, there, uh, over the course of my creative life, I think anger has ebbed, empathy has increased.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good thing. I think it's a healthy thing. It may be in a less in a less healthy way. I look at kind of my life in a very bifurcated way, because for my entire life up until 2017, I was a New York guy. I lived New York City my whole life. Late 2017, I moved to California
It's huge.
to rebuild and to do a lot of reflecting and kind of, try to fix some stuff. And so that's, again, looking at a lot of what preceded that move. It's like, wow, anger was really a very big part of who I was. Um, and so, you can write dark without it being so fucking angry. It's, you
Right.
can have more humanity in your work, and it's not selling out or going soft or any of the things maybe younger, less experienced, more whatever. There, it's, some could argue against it, but you know and yeah, you can, to talk about what we were just talking about, you can be more judicious in if you're mining your own life for people in particular. How do I work this in a way that does take into account that other person? So even if it's a person I don't like, even if it's a person this or that or the other thing, it's because
Yeah.
eventually it's going to rear its head that maybe you're not as comfortable with it as you once were, and knowing that maybe it did hurt somebody else or hurt their feelings or this or that. If you can sail through life with I don't give a shit, well, okay for you. Um, your work's probably going to be a bit superficial if that's how you do get through life.
Yeah. Listening to you say that makes me recognize that you can't create something, on a writing side without drawing things into, your experiences and into them. That's just the nature of writing. I mean,
Hmm.
even if you're writing science fiction, unless it's populated by drones, like you're not, like there are going to be people, and the people are going to be reflections and part and parcel of what you've experienced in life with other people.
Yeah.
And that's a big challenge, for all of us, and how we put that into the work, and to make it real, drawing upon that, you know whatever level of empathy you have in your life, and how do you translate that into, you're talking the sense of loss, like this is, we write with assumptions when we're young, and then we write with reflection, when we're older, because we've gone through these things. And that's the huge change that happens in the works that we hope that happen in our work.
Yeah. Well, that's why, I love sci-fi as a genre, but I don't really, whether it's at this point cliche, especially for people of a certain age and so forth and so on, but that's why Philip K. Dick is my favorite, is nobody brought their own life into their fantastical worlds more than him. He was just a
Yeah.
walking open wound, it's for good or for ill. When I started reading, because I came to it like so many people, I saw Blade Runner and I was like, what? This is amazing. I now need to read this guy's work. And then I read the book it was based on and thought, well, that's not like the movie, but the book's amazing. And now I'm going to read more. And the more I read, the more it was like, yeah, this is how you do it. Because his people were so flawed and so fragile. And so it was like everything that makes a literary novel, quote unquote, so-called serious literature,
Right.
more important or whatever, it was all there in Phil Dick, because he was obviously, if you know anything about the man, he was a frustrated writer of literary novels. He wanted to write literary novels. He did write literary novels. His agent discouraged him from writing them. It's like, nobody wants to read this. These are a dime a dozen. Keep churning out sci-fi. So I was like, okay, I'll do it. But his sci-fi was such a reflection of all the turmoil and all the people in his life.
Hmm.
Sometimes more obvious than other times, but
Well,
yeah.
it's no surprise that so much of his work has been adapted.
But what is surprising is how they miss that humanity.
Well, okay, but that just might be the fact that the people that he didn't write that stuff. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, you know, as great as the Lord of the Rings films were as an adaptation, they're nothing like the books in the terms of like the quality of how you feel about them. I mean, this is no big surprise unless it is, and then I'm very sorry for you. But the book's always better. Um, but like, Dick's stories, the core conceit of his stories typically are just so brilliant. And then you can fold in the fact that he also can write these characters in these stories that have such a wonderful and terrible quality to them that you are compelled to keep going every page with them.
Yeah, well, this is why sometimes I wish that there was a lottery system in the movie industry where certain directors would have to get pulled out of their comfort zones and make a movie that's not their genre. Like, because it's like, I would like to see Alexander Payne make a Philip K. Dick movie. It's like, that's a guy who will get
Wow.
it. Like, there's somebody who will absolutely, let's have Paul Giamatti as the star of a
Oh
Philip
yeah.
K. Dick movie, and then we're going to get the movie that I've been waiting for. Not that I don't enjoy the others, but it's like, can I please get one where we get the actual sense of what the books were like, and not just the broad strokes of the story. The story's fine, but let's get the intimacy, let's get the internalness, let's get so much of that stuff, and that's going to require a different kind of director.
Yeah, for
So
sure. Well,
um
how good was the Holdovers? I mean, it was
I
just
still haven't seen that one yet. I still haven't seen it,
like I'm
but
going to
I've
tell you,
seen
it's
all his
really
other
good.
work. So
It's
yeah,
really good.
I'm sure it is.
Um,
I'm sure it
yeah,
is. But yeah, don't we want the guy who made About Schmidt to do, the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch or something like that?
sure. Yeah.
Anyway, it's now become Dick Chat. Welcome to Dick Chat. So
Well, now we're
uh,
like a lot of other podcasts, I would guess, huh?
yeah,
Um,
probably.
but how, like, what's your, I mean, do you have a different process between writing prose and writing comics?
A little bit. In that I am very aware of my strengths and my limitations as an artist. And so, for quote unquote more serious stuff, I'm better suited as a writer. I just don't think
Okay.
my art style would really lend itself to something super serious. And if it did, I wouldn't want to draw it because it would be a drag for me. In a way, drawing for me is kind of an escape from how serious life is. That's why I tend to do humor. Um, there are definitely stories I still want to tell, but only as a writer, including comic stuff. There's things I would like to write as scripts that other artists would be much better at than me. Because I know for me, the struggle, even if I could get it down on paper, the struggle would be so unpleasant that I think it would infect the work.
Hmm.
Um, but in terms of the actual crafting of the story, they're pretty similar.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I've still have a lot of stories left that I want to tell. Um, I probably won't get to most of them. Life is short. And as the big 6-0 looms, this is a big year for me. um, Even if milestones are arbitrary and societally
Mm-hmm.
imposed, even though my voice sounds like absolute hell today, uh, 60 is just a number. It's the classic. I don't feel 60, but I'm also not the other side of that cliche coin where people say I still feel like a kid. I don't. I definitely don't. There's a lot of fucked up road behind me that
Yeah.
lets me know that I've lived a life so far. But it's a weird thing to it's because it's like I'm definitely not young, but I'm not old. It's and middle age doesn't sound right either. I'm not in the middle. I'm not going to be 120. Nope.
Right.
I don't want to be 120. It's a funny term, middle age. There needs to
Yeah.
kind of be a new term for when you're when you're older than young and yet not quite old, and middle doesn't really cut it. You would think with all
Middle-ish.
the writers out there, could somebody please? I'm not the one. I'm not up to the task. Sorry, but maybe we need new nomenclature for when you reach certain points in your life, especially now, because I mean, that's the other thing. When you look at people now, they look so much better than people used to. You know, this is again, this is a surface thing, but you watch movies from, you know, basically from the 70s going back, and you're like, you'll look at your phone like, how old is this person? Jesus
Right. I
Christ,
do that.
they're 35? They look like they're
It's like
80. It's, you know,
this is like every movie I have with my wife. We're sitting watching it, and I'm like, I'm 4 years older than this guy
yeah.
when he did this movie. And my wife would be like, fuck you. That's not true. I'm like, absolutely. It's so weird.
Yeah, I'm part of a movie night group, and I'll tell you, you know, we're pretty much all about, you know, the same age within a, you know, 10 years. Um, And invariably, as we're watching sometimes an older movie, some corner of the room will say, he's 35. And we're like, what? It's like, she's 42. What? It's like, they just look horrible. Everyone was just comprised of cigarettes and booze in those days.
Well, do you, I mean, travel back with me to our youth. Do you remember looking, first off, friends who had older siblings, who were like, I mean, like, older.
Yeah,
You
proper
they
older.
they all looked adult. Like they were like adults. I'm like, I'm in sixth grade and these people look like complete and utter adults. I remember looking at like my sister's like yearbooks. I have sisters who are like 8 and 10 years older.
Mm,
like they all have mustaches. Like
yeah.
it was it was a very different thing. They all looked like they were grown-ups comparatively.
Yeah. Yeah, I never I never had siblings, so I didn't experience that on either end of the equation, but yeah, I definitely had some friends who is like, "How old is your brother?"
Right.
It's like
So
who is
18,
that
you're like
guy?
18.
Oh, that's my brother. It's like, I don't know.
Right? There's some weird man in the other room. Oh, that's my brother.
Yeah, who is the dude in his underpants in the other room? Tell him to put his pants on. Yeah, yeah, that's my older brother. I hate him. Always invariably, and I hate him.
But he'll punch me if I say anything. So
Yeah. So
yeah, and I wonder, do kids 10 years who were 10 years younger than us looked at us and go, my God, look how old they are.
maybe I do know that I looked because partly because I was so small. I always looked younger than whatever grade I was in up until, you know, it's not like I had a giant growth spurt. I mean, I tapped out at 5'8", but I was glad to get to 5'8". You know, for a while there, I thought, oh my God, I'm just going to be the, can't use this word anymore, but everyone in context of the era, everyone's, hey, midget. You know, it's like,
Right.
well, you know,
Right. You can reflect the pejorative being used on you, I think. I think that's
well,
legitimate still.
yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
The rules keep changing, but I try to
I
be
know.
limber. I don't want to be
Right.
that guy who's, hey, I don't know what to call anyone anymore. I haven't gotten to that point yet,
I
but
pray we never do. Um, so how do you like so like for me, I'm having written enough prose, I got to the point where I was never precious. I'm not precious at all with what I'm writing, especially when it comes to sharing it with people. And because that I've learned was the fastest way to get to an actual interesting and truthiness um, piece of work on paper. And I mean, because, but in my experience, lots of comic book writing people typically like hold their cards real close to their chest. So do you have like some close people that you keep sharing your work with as you develop it, or do you work in your laboratory of fingermanness and then release it at a point?
yeah, I tend to work without showing as I work.
Okay.
Some of that comes from a couple of life lessons I got from either people who I observed or an early mentor. There was a cartoonist. So the first comic book professional that I became friends with was the late Howard Cruz. Howard Cruz was the friend of a coworker of my father, and my dad, would mention, my kid wants to be a cartoonist. I'm sure grumbling. "Eh, and so my dad was the managing editor of the company magazine at Western Electric Bell Labs. They had a magazine called We. I used to try to impress some of my friends by telling them my dad was the editor of We magazine, because there was also a men's magazine, OUI We. Oh wow, that. And then I would, because I could never live in the lie, especially when like, can you get us copies? I was like, well, no, I'm kidding. It's just the company magazine. Oh, boring punch. Um, but anyway, the art director of the magazine was friends with Howard. And so, and it turned out Howard lived mere blocks away from my dad's apartment. So he was very kind, very generous with his time. Um, and one of the kind of lessons I picked up was, don't talk about your work too much while you're doing it, or don't talk about specifically, like, don't tell the story, because then you've told the story. You lose some of your motivation to put it on paper because you've kind of gotten it out of your system. You've told the story.
Right.
So, other than the broad strokes, that's always kind of the way I've been once I really got serious about telling, especially long form stories. I mean, short form ones, I will do that because I want to make sure the punchline sticks the landing. And even there, usually I'll give the script. I'll say, hey, does this, 8 page or work or whatever? Um, my girlfriend, Val, she's a writer. So, and she's written comedies, she's a writer director. And actually, um, our coming together was great. That's a whole other thing. I'm not going to do meet cute nonsense on this, but suffice it to say, we share certain, um, in a way, creative motivation. Because she did a movie, she wrote and directed a movie called Love and Sex, with
Okay.
Jon Favreau and Famke Janssen, and it's analogous to minimum wage. It's absolutely autobiographical, but it's also fictionalized and heightened for the sake of humor, and et cetera, et cetera. So, uh, you know, um, so she's great to bounce things off of. She's a great writer herself, and her instincts are very good. So that's kind of different, um, than a lot of the way I've operated in terms of keeping things to myself over the years. But yeah, so it's not like I don't tell people what I'm working on. It's not like,
Right.
shit, I don't want to talk about it. I'll say, but I don't go into really much detail, and I don't kind of preview the work to people really until it's done, but not so done that I can't go and fix things, or, take the note, as they say. Um, but I had a friend years ago, and I'm not throwing anyone under the bus, but he would tell me these elaborate stories, like, this kind of, I'm not even going to say genre. I don't want to point any fingers at anyone, but I would be absolutely entranced. It was like, this sounds amazing. And he never did any of them,
Right. Yeah.
because I'm sure I wasn't the only one who was, a receptor for him running it by. And I'm not saying you can be one or the other, but for me, it was sort of, it illustrated very well Howard's
Sure,
advice.
his life lesson. No, and I think that's like, I think that also can swing both ways, because you could go out there and you say, hey, I got this idea for a story, and you tell a story and someone goes like, yeah, I guess it's good. I mean, it sounds like I think it's a good start, and then you can go, oh, I need to work on that. But if some people are like, oh, that's amazing, I can't wait for you to put that down, that might just be this huge barrier that gets thrown up between you and that finished piece of work, by going, oh boy, I don't know if I can make it as good as I just told it in that, in that coffee shop or wherever the place is.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm definitely not someone who will share the story early, but I'll share the premise. Like, does this premise work?
Yeah.
And if someone says, yeah, it sounds like something you could work with, all right, I'll tuck it away or I'll attack it right now. Um, Plot and premise are obviously two very different things too. I've
Yeah.
got tons of great premises that I never could figure out how to flesh out. It's like, oh, it's a great premise. Wish I could do something with it.
Right.
I'm either not
Where does
smart
this
enough
go?
or not whatever enough, but it's like, okay, maybe someday.
Well, it's a
Uh,
chemical reaction, right? Like you can walk around with that sort of inert premise, and then eventually that thing gets knocked on the table, and that spills over and dumps on the premise, and then some catalyst happens.
yeah, well, it's funny because in the book I'm preparing, that Some Business You're In, I'm putting some unpublished stuff in there, actually, fair amount. And there's a little sampler of pages of a story that I tried to start when I was just about 21. And I drew some pages, and that's really before I had any disciplined writing habits. It was pretty much write page to page. Maybe I'll thumbnail a few pages, but I didn't. I had an idea in here. I had an outline, sort of, but rough.
Right.
And needless to say, those stories were always aborted probably 5, 6 pages in, where I was just like, now I don't know what to do. Okay, put it aside. But the pages of this one story that I shared one abortive attempt at and then another abortive attempt at, uh, I managed to flesh out a couple of years ago and wrote an incredibly detailed outline. And I would love to do it. And that's one of those projects that I'm hoping I'll be getting to. But, there's something where it literally took decades to incubate, and
Wow.
it's not that I was thinking about it very often. Occasionally I'd think, oh yeah, that might have been fun. And
Yeah.
again, it was also this, you know, things that I fell in love with at the time. Oh, I can't wait to draw so and so. And then at a certain point I realized, oh, that's been jamming you up this whole time. Get rid of that. And then it
Hmm.
was like pushing a boulder out of the way, and the rest of the path suddenly revealed itself. It was like, oh, that one stupid thing that would have been fun to draw. That was the problem. That thing, that was the impediment. All the time I'd thought this is the glue. It wasn't. It was what was clogging up the pipe.
Yeah.
So, now hopefully I'll get to do this story at some point. That's one, by the way, that I might be more comfortable just writing for somebody else to illustrate, or maybe do it as a novel or something like that. Um, but yeah, the writing process to me is weirdly more porous and opaque. Drawing, if anything, is a much more linear process. You put literally linear. You're putting
Yeah.
pencil or whatever on paper, and it reveals itself, but you have a blueprint. You know what you're going to do.
Sure.
This is why, in a lot of ways, I love drawing, because I know I'm using a lot less of my brain. I can listen to podcasts, while I'm
Yes.
drawing. I can do other stuff
Uh-huh.
to occupy my attention because I'm only using this much, because it's
Mm.
really executing. It's executing
It
it
is.
hopefully well. It's trying to keep the line lively. It's all the things, but it's not thinking. It's executing.
The thinking comes in that when you're doing the layout and you're just figuring out all the constructions that need to happen
Yeah.
on the page and the panels. Once you're done there, it's like I said, it's music and all that kind of stuff. Like I don't get to do that work most often. I my don't draw for a living. It's been decades, but I'm doing advertising keyframes right now,
Mm-hmm.
and this is like once a year kind of project for me that happens, and I'm burning through podcasts. I'm having a great time. So
Yeah.
it's not it's great because it's a linear process. It's a reactionary process because you can see immediately when it's not working. Okay, wait, that I have to back up here with an eraser and figure this part out. Okay, now that makes and on we go. So
Yeah. I wish it was more. I mean, I wouldn't be looking at every single thing I ever drew saying, I wish I'd drawn this better or that better if it was right in the moment. Because sometimes in the moment you think that looks good. And then you look at it later and it's like,
well,
hmm.
sure.
But anyway,
But then again, but your best work at 20 is nothing compared to your best work at 30. I mean, it's just you progress.
yeah,
So
you hope so. I mean,
you right.
I look at the work I'm doing now and it's finally kind of beginning to look like how I'd hoped it would look. It's taken a while, it's taken a while. It's
Yeah.
not like I look at the work I did before and think junk. Um, but again, I can see, I mean, this is the thing. I've never had what you'd call a consistent style, even within the same book. If I learn something better while I'm working on something that'll make the rest of it look better, that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to keep repeating the thing that didn't look as good. So, this is where I've always had an admiration for those creators who really, it's almost like they're like a machine where they're so on model, to use the animation term, that's like, wow, you from frame one of the comic or panel one to panel 1000, that character looks exactly the same. It's like, how do you do it? I have no idea how you do it. None.
Yeah.
It's because it's all just, it's, you're growing. Hopefully you're evolving. You're, even if you don't want to be so kind and say growing and evolving, you're changing in
Mm.
real time. It's so when it gets put in a book, real time ceases to exist. It's now it's now an artifact. So if on page one your character looks like this and on the final page, like, skip ahead, it's like, whoa. It happens, but
Hey,
it's gradual. It's throughout the
and
book.
we all change. So why wouldn't character change in the book, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I've had
There you
weird
go.
quirks over the years of things that change within a book, and I'm just like, I don't know why that happened, but it happened on a subconscious level. Um, but
I
this is
think it's
why,
cool.
we're not machines.
No, no, I mean, we're a sharpened piece of bamboo skewer dipped in ink,
Yeah, yeah,
squiggling on a page,
yep, yeah. If we're lucky.
if we're lucky. So what was the impetus for putting together That's Some Business You're In?
Well, again, there's these milestones, and I was thinking, okay, this is my 2024 is my 40th year. I saw that. It's funny because I've been thinking about doing this book for a while, and then I saw that became like a meme among comic creators a few weeks ago, and I thought, God, I don't want to look like I'm jumping on a trend here, but everyone was suddenly saying, like, this is my 38th year, this is my 28th. Like, wait a minute,
Right.
why is
Yeah, yeah.
2024 the year everyone's jumping on that bandwagon? Get the
I
fuck off!
remember
This
it.
is my bandwagon.
They're all, you know what it is? It's just this, they're all psychically sensing what's about to come, Bob.
Oh my God! Well, I hope so. I hope they're supportive of my doing this then. But yeah, I don't know. Just 40 sounded big to me, and I'm not counting on getting to 50s. Who knows? Everything is so, again, it's all so precarious.
Right.
I like to think I'll get to a 50th and a 60th, but uh, we don't know what print is going to be like in 10 years from now, et cetera, et cetera. 40 just sounded, it's a good round number, started when I was 19. So,
Well, and so what was your, what do you think? I mean, like, what's the biggest takeaway for you in making this? Like, I mean, was there something, like, was there revelations? What was the thing that you could say, hey, wow, I didn't expect to feel this, think this, or learn this?
well, I mean, I'm still working on the book. I think 108 pages into it.
Okay.
Going to be a pretty big book. I mean, this is the stuff uh, I guess I'm supposed to tease, but also not reveal too much. At minimum, it'll be 150 pages. But yeah, going back over the course of a long career, it's a long career.
Yeah.
Um, on a purely technical level, it's interesting to look at the artwork as it does kind of evolve. Like the things that I gravitated towards years ago. I don't think maybe this anecdote's is in the text. You can tell me. You read the preview. Um, but years ago, I was part of a group art show. I think I did put it in because it was definitely, it's something, to borrow a catchphrase of a friend of mine. It was a raspberry tooth stuck in my wisdom tooth for many years. I won an award, quote unquote. I keep doing the quote unquote. Got to get over that. But it was a very ironic award. They made up awards at this art show, and it was, I won most preciously overworked art. And I laughed. I got my little statuette, but I thought, God, that's rough. It's like, because that, any good zinger lands because it's accurate.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks about that zinger if it was like, well, that's clearly inaccurate, so who cares? That one landed hard. Um, there was that, because definitely one of those motivators of, probably my whole career was, I got something to prove. I have to
Mm,
prove that I deserve to be in print. I have to prove that, I deserve the attention of people. I need to, I mean, in a way, I guess it's a good motivation because it's like, I want to earn what I've got, even if the page rate's insulting, whatever. It's like I never want anyone to feel like I didn't earn it. I earned every penny.
right.
Um, and so, there are phases of my career where some of that wanting to earn it was working in ways that were clearly uncomfortable to me. It's like, because, like, well, I think this is how it should be done, and there was a time where, like, if there was a curved line on my paper, it was only achieved through the use of a French curve. It's like
Right.
everything, because I was never a brush guy. It was always a pen guy. And, for the first, I don't know how many years, a lot of years, I inked with technical pens, which have no
Right.
flexibility. So to get line weight variation, it was always building up the line. And I
Yeah.
can't do this line perfect curve over and over again. Well, I'll get my French curve and I'll do. And the thing is, you do all that and it's very constructed. And I'm not looking at it saying, well, this doesn't hang together. It all hangs together. But there's no spontaneity. Spontaneity was, I think, in the grand scheme, the artists whose work I've always admired were the ones who had a snappy line, as they say, you know, somebody like Jack Davis, snappy line, Mort Trucker, snappy line. Then when you started looking at some of the Europeans, I mean, one of the, actually, I didn't mention earlier, but one of the other comics that I looked at as a kid with great admiration and fascination was Tintin. You know, my mom started
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
me the Tintin books, and I was just like, wow, these are amazing. These are incredible stories. Talk about somebody who was always on model. Boy, oh boy, nobody tops Hergé. Hergé was the king of staying on model. But beautiful line, not snappy, beautiful. And then when I started seeing heavy metal, and like when I first saw Mobius, of course, it was, you know, the cinematic thing of the clouds part, the sun shines. It was like,
Right.
okay, this is it. This man's a genius, because
Mm-hmm.
his work was everything that I thought comics should be. It didn't feel fussy, and yet it was absolutely kind of perfect and beautiful and
Mm-hmm.
rendered. And there was all this stuff going on. It was this alchemy of all these things happening where none of it felt like this is a guy who's sweating over every line. And, you know, one of the great honors of my life was I got to visit Mobius in his home, and, you know, got to basically, he critiqued minimum wage when I was, see, he got to see it before. You asked
There you go.
who got to see
You
it before
shared
it was in print.
you shared with Mobius.
He saw the first Mobius stuff. I mean, he saw the first minimum wage stuff before it was finished,
Mm-hmm.
and he critiqued it. And I didn't really get his critique, not just because he was speaking in French. We had a translator there. Um, and I, looking back, I agreed with some of what he said and disagreed with some. He said the character Rob was too specific looking. He's too specific. And that's because he was looking at that the main character is the reader's avatar. So it should be sort of a blank slate. It's like Jerry Seinfeld's not the most interesting character on Seinfeld. He's
Right.
ostensibly who the audience experiences the show through, as with many comedies. Mary Tyler Moore is not the funniest one. She's funny, but not the funniest, but she is who we experience everything through. I'm picking all these current references, you know, for the kids.
Yeah.
Um, but to me, it was like, well, Rob is very specific, so he should look specific. I now understand what he was getting at. And in some cases, that absolutely works. Your guy is the blank in a way. Um, so, but to go back to the question of like, what am I learning looking at this? It's like only now, like within the last, I'd say 15 years, has have I gotten comfortable enough with the way I work that there's a liveliness in the work.
Hmm.
Because it did take a while, you know, to get either more comfortable with materials, to find the materials that didn't exist then. You know, the art supplies do evolve too. And when Dave Johnson, bless his soul, introduced me to these Kuretake flexible nib
Dude,
disposable pens,
I got a couple in here. Yeah.
oh, there you go. Well, those were a game changer for me.
Yeah.
100%, because suddenly I could ink quick. It wasn't dragging the pen, you know, the first run of minimum wage. I like the way it looks, don't get me wrong, but that was fountain pen. And there was still more grace to that line than anything that had preceded it. That was kind of a piece of connective tissue. You used that phrase before. Funny, I have a book called Connective Tissue. Um, but it was. Uh, but then the Kuritakis were like, oh, I can ink fast.
Yeah.
And everything changed. And like now I look at like all the work I've inked since the introduction, since the Johnson moment, since the Kuritakis became regular tools. So I look at minimum wage phase two, the image ones. And I see a lot more. I mean, in a weird way, it's definitely, I look at that and I feel like that's my work. That looks like me. But I also
Hmm.
see more of my influences in it than I did earlier because I see more of the original Mad Guys in it because the line is beginning to look less fussy. The fussiness,
You mean a little snappier?
it's a lot snappier.
Yeah.
Because there's also not the fear of like, oh, this is an expensive little technical pen. I must be delicate with it. Kuritaki's, yeah, these are a couple bucks a piece. I can smash that nib. I can, get that big
Mm-hmm.
fat line, get that little skinny line. Oh, the pen's no good anymore. I'll save it for dry brush technique and throw it in a pile. Uh, it makes a difference. And also when I started doing finished work with pencil, why should Gene Colan have all the fun? Uh,
Totally.
and that again, and then that's basically the way I do most of my work is, colored pencil as my black,
Mm-hmm.
and then digital paint. But it's made a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing is that so many of these tools are an advancement in the production line. They've just made the process of getting to that final thing so much. I'm going to use the word easier. The work is still hard, but the tools have streamlined so much of that work that we had to do 30 years ago, or in your case, 40 years ago. Um,
Yeah,
um, it's just a really interesting thing. And yeah, you're right. I mean, those Kuritakis are great. If I was drawing on a regular basis, for my livelihood, they would be in full rotation
I wish
because
I wish I'd had anything like that earlier. I think the growth curve would have been tighter. The art would have been
oh yeah.
looser, and the learning curve would have been tighter.
I've known Dave since the early '90s, and I mean, he's always been ahead of every single thing when it came to like tools. I think he was the first one to really get me to drawing with very thin color pencils. It's like, yeah, try those, because the line wasn't like drawing with a regular Prismacolor,
Mm-hmm.
because the lead was a little harder and smaller. You could get an accurate line,
Yeah,
and it made the drawing aspect much more comfortable. Um, Everything. I mean, he's always been sort of the man to go to for those things.
yeah. Well, you know, he does great work, and like I look at somebody like Dan Panosian,
Oh my, snappy line,
the snappiest. He might be the snappiest guy in the business right now.
dude. Bob, Dan's. I mean, I mean, Dan is channeling all of the people that you've been talking about, or
Oh yeah.
in a way that is just pure magic.
See, I'd
We
love
we
to. I'd love to write something for him someday. He and we're friends, but I would love to write a humor book for him someday because oh my god, he would destroy it. He would just. It
yeah.
would be. It would be the best thing since the original Mad. Just looks so amazing.
He's like Jack Davis doing bare knuckled fight comic books.
Yeah.
It's so crazy cool.
Yep.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love it.
He's.
So when's the book, the campaign for the book? It starts next week or the week after? The week after.
What's today's date? Today's the 24th. Next week.
Yeah, next week. Yeah. So this comes out the day before the campaign. So this will drop. So when you're listening to this tomorrow, the campaign starts.
Yeah, it starts
So
on the 30th,
yeah, or the day, whatever.
I
Yeah,
think.
whenever this comes out. Maybe this comes. I don't know. This comes out on a Tuesday, so I know that much. That's as scientific as I get. Here, I'm looking at a calendar.
Well,
This comes out on the 30th. So if it comes out on the 30th, it comes out the same day.
boom.
So yeah, and it goes. So it's out on Zoop, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everyone. Yeah, okay. Yeah, let me go into
I
salesman
know.
mode. Yeah, everyone, please. No, but seriously, if you're still listening, if, for everyone who hasn't said, God, this guy loves the sound of his own voice. I don't. Um, yeah, I do think it's going to be a pretty special book, and I really want this to feel like something Harry Abrams would put out. It's not just. I think it's a good read. It's real solid, and I think it's well designed. So, and again, that get your money's worth thing. It's going to be a tome,
Yeah.
a real bug smasher of a of a heavy book. So, uh, yeah, please go over to Zoom and show some support. I certainly would appreciate it. I'd love this book to exist, even if it features this was the last, I guess, the last thing. You have to be objective. It's very hard to be objective, when you look at your old work and your first kind of instinct is to cringe a bit. But if you're going to do an overview, that's kind of the point. It's like, in a way, you put the cringe in to get to the good stuff. And to be honest, a lot of people love what makes me cringe. One thing I had to get over when I would do comic conventions is, and again, this is learned behavior. I now know better, but when people used to bring me the early stuff, I'd be there to be supporting my whatever the new thing was, and they shove something under me that's 20 years old, and I would go, oh, geez,
Right.
don't do that. Don't make your fan
No,
feel like an idiot for liking what they like.
no.
So I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot of stuff in there that maybe it doesn't meet my current standards, but I know a lot of people liked it. I cut my teeth working for Cracked Magazine and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and all that stuff. It was all part of the process. And, so this book's going to have a little, I guess I could say this, it's got a little something for everyone because I've worked for everyone. So, you know,
And the stories are great. I mean, it's a great cross section of the last 40 years, you know, in the comics publishing industry. Let's keep that very vague.
well, thanks. And, I wanted the written content of the book to also be good. I didn't want it to just be a picture book that people leaf through. I definitely wanted it to encapsulate, especially what it was like cutting one's teeth professionally starting in the, mid 80s. It was a different world, completely different
It
world.
was a completely different world. It was, but yeah. I mean, I think it's great. And I'm excited that it's coming out. I mean, I think this. I think we can. I mean, this. That's kind of why I do the podcast. I like getting into the mind and the experience of the people who make the things that we all dig, and being able to sit and read something that you put down on paper that's about your thought and experiences of making these things is that's important.
I agree. And
There
it's
you go.
and everyone does it different. There's always going to be overlap and
Yeah.
commonalities, but that's the interesting thing about art is, yeah, everyone's a little unique snowflake. So,
Well, my new snowflake friend, um, thanks for joining me, man.
thank you for having me. This is going to be a great 20 minutes when you cut it down.
I'm good. Yeah, it'll be tight 20. The link to the campaign will be in the description, so anybody listening can go down there and click on it and go right to it. So
Fabulous.
thanks, Bob.
All right, thank you. Bye.